Most people have the wrong model of how thinking works in a room. They assume that the thinking happening visibly, out loud, in real time, through the continuous externalization of ideas as they form, is what gets registered as intelligence. They assume the room is watching them think and updating its model of their capability accordingly. That more visible thinking produces more assigned authority. This assumption is wrong, and the cost of holding it in rooms where authority is actually assigned and contested is not small. What the room is actually tracking is not the quality of your thinking. It is the relationship between what you choose to say and what you appear capable of withholding. Because the room understands something below the level of conscious analysis that most participants never articulate. A person who externalizes their thinking as it forms has no more depth than what is currently visible. The surface and the interior are the same thing. What you see is what there is. The person who withholds, who allows thoughts to complete themselves in private before releasing only the conclusions, creates an entirely different impression. Not because they are concealing something, because the discipline required to hold a half-formed idea until it is ready is itself evidence of a mind operating at a different level than the minds producing continuous output around it. This is the principle behind room control that almost no one names correctly. It is not about speaking less. It is about what the discipline of withholding reveals about how a mind actually works, and why rooms assign authority to that revelation in ways they never assign it to volume. There are two ways to use your mind in a room. The first is to think in order to speak. You process information as it arrives, generate responses as they form, and externalize the formation process in real time. This feels like engagement. It feels like contribution. It is, in the precise sense that matters to how rooms assign authority, a confession. The second is to speak in order to have thought. You run a parallel interior process, deeper, slower, more selective, while the surface conversation proceeds without you. You are not absent from the room. You are operating below its visible layer, processing what the visible layer cannot reach, and producing conclusions rather than process. The room can feel the difference, not intellectually, structurally. Here is what this looks like in practice. A board-level discussion. 8 people, a significant strategic decision, 90 minutes on the calendar. Over the course of that meeting, one person at the table contributes perhaps 4 times, not because they have nothing to say. Their interior process is running the entire time, tracking the conversation, identifying what is not being said, locating the assumption beneath the surface argument that everyone is treating as settled, but that is, in fact, the actual fault line. They are waiting, not passively, but with the specific patience of someone who understands that the moment of genuine leverage has not yet arrived. When it does, they speak. And not to add another layer to the surface discussion. To name the thing the surface discussion has been unable to reach, and the room, which has been generating content for 80 minutes without arriving anywhere, stops. Reorganizes, moves toward what was just said. What just happened is not charisma, it is not rhetorical skill, it is the product of an interior process that was permitted to run to completion rather than being continuously interrupted by the compulsion to demonstrate itself. The people in that room do not consciously register what they are responding to, but they register it. And in the accounting that happens after consequential meetings, in the conversations about who to bring into the next one, who to consult, whose judgment carries weight, the person who spoke 4 times and changed the direction of the room is not weighed equally against the person who spoke 40 times and produced content. They are in different categories, because what they demonstrated is different in kind, not just in degree. Most capable people never make this distinction because they were trained in environments where the 2 types of thinking were rewarded identically. In school, the visible process was the proof. Raising your hand demonstrated engagement. Speaking demonstrated competence. The grade was, in part, a function of participation, which meant that externalizing your thinking was not just acceptable but required. You built a deep behavioral habit around the equation. Visible thinking equals demonstrated value. That habit follows most people into every room they subsequently occupy, and in rooms where authority is actually assigned, it works precisely against them, because those rooms do not reward the visibility of your process. They reward the quality of your conclusions, and conclusions, by definition, are what survives the editing. They are the output of a mind that has done its work privately, refused to externalize the formation, and released only what remains after everything non-essential has been discarded. The man whose editing happens in public has told the room something he cannot take back. The interior and the exterior are the same. There is no private process. What you see is the whole thing. That is not authority. That is transparency. And transparency, in rooms where power is the variable being negotiated, is a structural disadvantage that no subsequent display of intelligence can correct. Machiavelli spent considerable intellectual energy on a question that political theorists of his era consistently avoided: not how to acquire authority, but how to make it durable. What separates the structures that survive from the ones that dissolve the moment pressure arrives? His answer was not about capability, it was about architecture. Specifically, the architecture of what others are permitted to know about how you think. He observed that the prince who allows his reasoning to become visible in council, who externalizes the formation of his judgment rather than its conclusions, commits an error that no subsequent demonstration of intelligence can repair. Not because the reasoning is weak, because revealing it transfers something from the prince to the room, the ability to manage him. If the council can observe how the prince moves through a problem, what information shifts his position, what sequence of argument he cannot easily resist, where his reasoning has edges he cannot defend, they possess something more strategic than any single piece of intelligence. They possess the architecture of his decision-making. And a person whose decision-making architecture is fully legible to the people around him has ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be making decisions. He is being navigated, managed toward conclusions others have already determined through the precise calibration of what they choose to present. This is not a historical curiosity. It is the operating mechanism of every high-stakes room today. The executive who thinks out loud in strategy sessions, who shares the reasoning as it forms, who signals through the quality of his responses what arguments are landing and which are not, has given the people in that room something invaluable, not information, a map, and a person whose map is visible can be navigated by anyone who has studied it. Machiavelli called what this destroys gravitas. Not gravity in the sense of seriousness, but weight in the literal sense, the quality that causes others to approach your conclusions as things that must be waited for, because they cannot be anticipated. A man without gravitas is not a man who is liked less. He is a man whose conclusions the room has already accounted for before they arrive, whose authority has been, through the simple act of making his thinking visible, made predictable. And predictable authority is not authority. It is a known quantity being managed. Robert Greene arrived at the same principle from a different direction. What he documented across 5 centuries of courts, hierarchies, and competitive institutions was the specific mechanism through which significance is projected by observers onto figures they cannot fully account for. His observation, when a person's thinking is fully visible, when they engage with everything, produce continuously, leave no gap between interior and exterior, the observer has no work to do. There is nothing to project. The picture is complete, and complete pictures cannot be enlarged. But when the picture has gaps, when the observer cannot quite account for everything, I cannot fully explain the selections being made, cannot predict with confidence what will come next. The observer's mind does what minds do with incomplete information. It fills the gaps, not with nothing, with something more impressive than any explanation would have been. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is the deliberate outsourcing of communication to the imagination of everyone in the room. And imagination, given an incomplete but compelling subject, almost always produces something more formidable than the reality. The practical implication: every time you speak in a consequential room, you're making the picture slightly more complete, slightly more legible, slightly more predictable. The man who speaks continuously has, by the end of the meeting, given the room a complete picture. They know how he thinks. They know where he will land. They know how to manage him. The man who speaks selectively has given the room a partial picture, specific, compelling, but with significant gaps that the room will fill in his favor. That gap is not a deficit. It is the structural source of everything the room calls authority. The mechanism Machiavelli identified operates today with a precision he could not have anticipated, because the signals are now continuous and their legibility is near total. In a 15th century council, a prince's thinking was visible only to those physically present. The damage of transparency was local. Today, the equivalent signals radiate outward, across professional networks with a granularity and permanence that fundamentally changes the stakes of every behavioral decision you make. Consider what your communication pattern has been communicating. Not about your availability, not about your reliability, but about the relationship between your interior process and your external output. The professional who responds to every message within minutes is not communicating that he is diligent. He is communicating that the gap between receiving information and producing a response is very small, that there is not much happening in between, that the interior process, if it exists at all, does not require time. This is the modern version of thinking out loud, and it produces the modern version of the same result Machiavelli documented: a person who is legible, predictable, easy to account for, whose conclusions, because they arrive so quickly, carry the implicit signal that not much concluded them. Now, consider the professional who operates differently, not slower as a performance, but genuinely slower, because his interior process is real and it takes the time it takes. His responses arrive considered rather than reflexive. When he engages in a meeting, the contribution lands differently because the room has been conditioned, through accumulated behavioral evidence, to understand that what it is receiving has survived a selection process it did not witness. There is a gap between the input and the output, and the room fills that gap with something it cannot verify but also cannot dismiss. This distinction crystallizes in negotiation, which is where the architecture of interior process becomes most consequential and most visible. Two professionals, comparable in capability, entering a salary conversation. The first has spent months making his thinking visible. Reflexive responses, continuous accommodation, every internal evaluation immediately externalized as a yes before the counterparty has finished speaking. His manager walks into that negotiation with a complete picture. He knows the response architecture. He knows where the limits are. He knows the conversation will end with accommodation because it always does. The second professional's picture has gaps. The manager is not certain what he would accept, not because the information has been withheld strategically, but because the interior process has never been made fully visible. There is a genuine unknown in the room, and genuine unknowns in negotiation to produce a different kind of attention, the attention of a person who knows they are dealing with something they have not yet fully accounted for. The outcome of these two negotiations is not determined by who prepares better or argues more skillfully. It is determined by whose thinking the other person already knows and whose they do not. The same dynamic governs intellectual authority in the spaces where professional reputation compounds over time. The voice that posts every thought accumulates reach. The voice that posts only what has survived a rigorous interior process accumulates something rarer: credibility. Not because credibility is a reward for restraint, but because credibility is what observers assign to outputs whose selection process they cannot fully explain. When you cannot account for why something was chosen, when the output is clearly deliberate, but the deliberation is not visible, you assign it significance that visible deliberation never receives. Reach is produced by volume. Credibility is produced by the inference of an interior process that the output implies but does not reveal. The recalibration begins not with behavior, but with a precise diagnosis of what drives the behavior you are trying to change. Most capable men who find themselves externalizing their thinking in rooms, who discover on honest examination that they are producing output before their interior process has finished running, are not doing it from confidence. They are doing it from a specific discomfort with holding incomplete thoughts. The half-formed idea feels, while it is held, like a liability. The compulsion to externalize it is a compulsion to get it outside the system, to make it visible, to transform it from something uncertain and internal into something stated and concrete. This is the mechanism worth understanding first, because every behavioral fix that does not address it will fail. Performed restraint, silence as a tactic, withholding as a strategy, collapses under pressure because the discomfort driving the original behavior is still there. The room can feel the effort. There is a stiffness to tactical silence that is categorically different from the stillness of a person who has genuinely made peace with holding an incomplete thought until it is ready. That peace is what actually needs to be developed. And it develops from a single realization. Incomplete thoughts are not liabilities. They are evidence that the interior process is running. The discomfort of holding them is not a problem. It is the sensation of thinking, of the kind of thinking that produces conclusions rather than content. The man who has internalized this does not experience the impulse to externalize early as a compulsion he must resist. He experiences it as information. The thought is not ready. He waits. What this produces in rooms is not silence. It produces a specific quality of contribution, the contribution that arrives already complete, that does not require elaboration because it was elaborated privately, that lands with a density the room was not generating on its own. The room receives it differently, not because of what it says, but because of what the process it implies suggests about the mind producing it. The most powerful application of this is the question. And it deserves particular attention because it is the verbal move that most precisely demonstrates the interior process without revealing it. An assertion shows the room what you know. A well-constructed question shows the room how your thinking operates, specifically that it has been operating at a level of abstraction the surface conversation was not reaching. The question that reframes, that names the assumption everyone was treating as settled, that surfaces the tension the discussion was circling without addressing, cannot be generated reactively. It requires an interior process that has been running in parallel with the visible conversation, accumulating observations without discharging them. I'm building toward the intervention that will change the room's geometry rather than adding another element to its surface. The man who has spent the meeting contributing to the surface cannot generate that question. He has spent his processing capacity in public. The man who has been holding his process private has been compounding it. What this means behaviorally, the measure of contribution shifts. The question you bring to a room changes from, "What can I add here?" which is a permission structure for unlimited output because something can almost always be added, to a more demanding standard. Does this thought, in its current state, represent the output of a completed interior process? Or is it the process itself, still running, being discharged prematurely because holding it is uncomfortable? That distinction, applied consistently, changes what leaves you. And what leaves you is the only thing the room can evaluate. The final dimension is the most structural and the hardest to engineer deliberately. the relationship between your pattern of contributions and the expectation the room develops about you over time. A room that has never seen your thinking externalized prematurely, that has only ever received your conclusions, already filtered, already complete, develops an expectation, not a conscious one, a conditioned one. It begins to treat the space between your contributions as evidence of the interior process rather than absence of one. Your silence becomes legible as selection rather than vacancy. That conditioned expectation is what separates the person who controls a room from the person who participates in one. It is not built in a single meeting. It is built through the accumulated behavioral pattern of many meetings, each one adding another data point to the model the room holds of how your mind works, until the model has enough evidence to generate the expectation on its own. Once the expectation exists, it precedes you. The room you walk into has already assigned you a kind of authority based on the pattern it has observed. Your contribution, when it comes, is received within that frame. It lands heavier than the same words would land from someone whose pattern has not produced that expectation. This is why the behavioral change cannot be a tactic. Tactics modify individual instances. What you are building is a pattern, and patterns require consistency over time, which requires that the underlying orientation is genuine, not performed restraint. An actual relationship to your own thinking that makes the discipline natural because it reflects something you have genuinely come to understand about the difference between process and conclusion, between contributing and controlling, between filling a room and building one. There is a question worth sitting with when the meeting ends and the room clears. Not whether your arguments landed, not whether you were heard, whether the room, when it replays the conversation internally, as rooms always do, in the hours and days after a consequential decision, whether the picture it has of you is more complete than it was before you walked in. If it is significantly more complete, you have made a withdrawal you may not be able to recover. You have given the room more of your map, made yourself more legible, more predictable, more accountable to a model of you that the room now holds and will use. If the picture is more complete in the specific way that matters, they know more about the quality of your conclusions, less about the architecture of your process. You have built something. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the model they hold of you has been updated in the direction of authority rather than familiarity. Machiavelli's deepest observation about durable power was not about what you do, it was about what you allow to be known. The prince who controlled that architecture controlled the terms of every engagement that followed, not through deception, through the deliberate governance of what the room could see and the strategic protection of what it could not. Every room you enter is that decision, made again. Every contribution is a choice about what to make visible. Every moment of restraint is not silence. It is the interior process, running, completing the thought, testing the conclusion, determining whether what is forming is worth releasing or worth holding until it is something better. The man who has internalized this does not try to control rooms. He does not need to. He is built through the accumulated patience of not externalizing his thinking prematurely, a specific expectation in the minds of the people who matter, the expectation that what he produces has survived something they did not witness. That survival is what authority actually looks like, not volume, not velocity, not the continuous demonstration of a mind in motion, the conclusion quietly arrived at. Released when it is ready, build the interior first.